All right, welcome to another show, the Research to Reps Roundtable. I am your co-host, Dr. Coach Pat Ivey, and I'm here with my awesome co-host. I'll start with Dr. Ted Lambrinides. Ted, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Pat. Had a great weekend and looking forward to having a nice discussion with Jen today.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to this one as well. And Dr. Ernie Reimer, I know you're going to do an awesome intro, but how are you doing? First, how are you doing?
I am doing just swell, Dr. Ivy and Dr. Ted. Thank you. And I'm standing here today, and I'm about 5'7". I have shoulder width and I have bone breadth, and I'm just curious to know like how much muscle I could pack on to this skeleton. I'm sure we're going to talk about that today, but before we do, we have a very special guest here, the one and only Jen Gibson. This is someone who has worked in the Olympic Committee for 2 different countries in professional sport, someone who's done consulting and has a private business. Jen, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. I'm in Colorado right now, and it's supposed to snow tomorrow. So that's what's going on here. 10 inches, apparently.
That seems like a lot of snow.
Yeah, well, it is for this time of year. This is when we all start to complain, because as Coloradans, you're over it by this time of year, and it's not supposed to be this way. So we all just start to get really sassy this time of year with the snow.
I was going to ask if you would be out snowshoeing, if you would be snowboarding or skiing or just shoveling.
Oh, well, all of the above, probably. I live on a bit of property, and so I actually, whenever it snows enough, I cross country ski a 1 mile loop, and then it's actually a lot of fun, and just kind of go out the backyard and have a lot of fun in it. So
that's great.
Yeah.
Just to kick in here a little bit, would you just tell us a little bit about yourself and bring us up to speed on what you're doing now?
Sure. So I'm a performance dietitian and exercise physiologist. I've been kicking it in the elite sport world for 18 years now, which seems like incredible to think about. I started off my career in Canada, working for basically Team Canada Olympic sports. There was a bunch of funding that came in as we obtained the 2010 Olympic bid in Vancouver. And so kind of worked through with a whole bunch of different sports in Canada through that funding cycle, and then got recruited down to Colorado Springs to work with Team USA and acrobat and combat sports. And that's actually my sport background, is combat sports. So it was a real dream of mine to support judo, wrestling, taekwondo, boxing, helping athletes make weight. From a physiological and nutrition perspective, I was in heaven. It was awesome. We did a lot of really fun stuff, helping guys make weight and gals make weight. And then kind of got into some NFL circles, did some consulting with the Saints while I was there at the Olympic Committee, and then kind of got recruited to the NFL to go work with the Chicago Bears, where I was sports science coordinator and sport dietitian for the team, and kind of helped to build basically a program there from nothing. So spent 7 seasons doing that, and then just finished up that career journey last year in 2022, and I'm back in Colorado Springs and started up a couple businesses, just doing elite performance and physiological consulting.
Jen, with all the different sports that you've been involved with, which one is the most challenging?
Oh, the most challenging. Oh my goodness. Well, physiologically, the most challenging ones was combat sports, because you're in some cases, depending on when you get the athlete in their phase of making weight, they're having to do a huge physiological stressor to their body before having to maximally exert themselves to compete. And so from a management of that kind of overall system, and where I kind of came into play, if we got them early enough, maybe 3 months out, we could help to slow cook that weight management process. But sometimes, we're dealing with like a very acute weight cutting situation, and in the Olympic world, you can't use IVs because that's illegal. So it was just all the tricks of the trade, because if that athlete doesn't make weight, they don't compete, and that's the end. So that was probably the most challenging from a scientific perspective. And then culturally speaking, definitely working in the NFL culturally was probably the most challenging group of athletes to work with and to build a program around. But a lot of that just had to do with the fact that they had never had a woman on staff. And so in addition to kind of building a program they never had, I had to kind of deal with the cultural landscape at the time, which funny enough, only 8 years ago, there was only 6 of us full-time women in the NFL at the football ops level. So that was just an interesting landscape to navigate. And it's kind of fun to look back and look at the league now and see how far we've come from that perspective. I'm supposed to ask you a question now.
Sure.
Are we there? I've heard this is how we do it.
Yes.
So, Dr. Erdy, tell me a little bit about, I know that you were at US Ski and Snowboard. Tell me a little bit about your most unique challenges working there. Physiologically.
Yep. So when I was at the US Ski and Snowboard Association, when I came in, we were the sports science department, and at that point in time, we were just really growing. And sports science was about education and trying to facilitate greater education so that the coaches themselves and the different full-time staff working with the teams could do a better job. And at that point, we didn't provide a real strong model for like services from top to bottom, like the elite teams all the way down to the developmental athletes who were named to the developmental team. And one of the unique challenges that I faced was that I was hired to build a strength conditioning program, first and foremost, for the women's alpine ski team. And to that, when I first went in, and we only served the elite team, so that'd be A team and B team. And there was maybe only 6 racers out of 30 from A through development, A team through development, that were doing anything with the sports science department. Only 1 athlete was doing like the full comprehensive strength conditioning program on a year-round basis. When I was hired, there wasn't a strength conditioning professional who had ever lasted more than a year with the women's alpine ski team. And my job was first get past a year, because that had never happened before. They'd either said, I'm out, deuces, or they said, deuces, you're out. And so the first benchmark was just get past a year. And 6 years later, long story short, we did win over that team. We did eventually start providing services top to bottom from A to D team. And the only racer on the team who wasn't fully immersed in 100% of our package was a racer who had a lucrative sponsorship from an energy drink company, and they provided a full-time service for her in that area. So that was the only one. So we were basically like 29 out of 30, and we eradicated season-ending knee injuries. We were the number 1 ranked speed team in the world, and our developmental team was really having tremendous success. So the biggest challenge was just learning how to navigate how to enter a program where someone had never been there for a year and help them understand like what service could look like, and then learn how to ski and adapt to their culture and build something special. And we had a ton of success. Obviously, it wasn't just me, but we built a whole team around it. So it was really successful. And I might, pitch the same question over to Dr. Ivey. Pat, you've had a couple of different unique roles in your career, but maybe early on coming into your current position here at U of L, like what has been one of the unique challenges you faced either early on or currently you are facing?
That is a very good question. I was actually going to ask Jen a very similar question to get some ideas from her experiences, but I'll answer your question.
I see what you tried to do right there. You were getting ready to just like pass that.
No.
Just like pass that ball right back over to Jen.
No. I passed it and then I have it back. And so I would say this idea that different areas, different departments previously reported up to different administrators, and now my position was created so that all of these different health and performance areas report up through me. And the idea that I'll give you the story from the athletics director who hired me at the time. He said he had a committee of about 12 people, and he went around the table. Okay, what are we looking for? What qualities, what experiences, what are we looking for? And the strength and conditioning coach said, oh, it should be someone with a coaching background, preferably in a performance background. The trainer said it should be someone with a sports medicine background. The mental health people said, well, it definitely needs to be someone with a background in dealing with athletes, dealing with coaches. And then the administrator said, well, this isn't associate AD position. It should be someone that has an leadership administrative background. And I think I had been here for a full year, and he brought this back up into the entire health and performance department. He said, no one said it. No one said what I was looking for. He said, I was looking for a leader. I was looking for someone to say, we need a leader. And I think that has been a challenge for people to say, okay, I would prefer if it was someone that had my background that was in that position, but it doesn't make it the best way to do things. You need leaders in leadership positions, people that will make the right decision, the hard decision, people that will listen, people that will care, people that will think holistically. So having this holistic vision and saying we're all going to work together, like that's been a challenge, and that continues to be a challenge. So answering your question, Ernie, I now want to turn it to Jen and ask, you worked in two other areas that I have found to be very challenging for other people to want. So from nutrition and then the science, it's like, well, we know how to eat. So we know how to feed our athletes. We just need to make sure you have the food here and you clean up. And all right. And then exercise science. I don't really want anyone telling me how to design my practices. I know what I'm doing. I've been doing this for a long time. And you did both in the NFL, and I have experience in the NFL. So what did you do to increase buy-in, get buy-in, overcome challenges, barriers with two of the most difficult areas to get people to buy into? And then you added a third layer on it. Help us out.
Well, the way I've always approached things, because I'm old, and I asked that question to Ernie and I think we're probably all in the same vintage where we kind of have come in at the beginning of really these integrations of high performance models in sport. We've all been part of the genesis in some ways in different environments. But part of my experience taught me, coming in, anytime you're building something new, the first thing I did was, in that first year, is I just learned and observed and started to just, instead of going in like, shoot first, aim later, gunslinger, look at all this, I'm going to bring in all this tech. I'm going to do all this stuff, look at these force plates, look at all this. We'll bring in the Dari. Instead of just trying to justify my existence with bells and whistles, I just kind of spent the first season learning about, how does this head coach run this team? What's his attitude towards things? We did implement GPS the first season I was there, but guess what? Nobody saw the data. It was a silent, we did it on purpose. We tracked and looked at data internally. No one saw it for the first season, because we just had to kind of make sense of it ourselves. At the time, it wasn't even something people were often doing in football. But so my first approach was to assess. And then the second part of that was to develop relationships, meeting with each of the individual coaches, asking them about their experience in the area, what was important to them, because some coaches didn't care. And guess what? That's okay. Respect that, I feel like when you're dealing with a population of athletes or colleagues, it's like the bell curve. You have You're going to have your 10% at one end that absolutely care about everything. You know, they're the ones that are like all in on everything. Then you've got your 10% at the other end that don't give a crap and they don't care. And I'm old school. I don't believe in science. And they're never going to join the curve. They're just always going to sit there. And then you got your 80%, which is the majority, the majority, and you can kind of keep pushing them along the continuum. So for me, I was trying to place them. Where are they on my bell curve? My 10% at this end, I don't need to do anything because they're bought in. Where are my 80%? Where do they sit? And how can I kind of notch them over? And in some cases, it was almost just like okay, this coach really cares about the body composition of his players. Okay, so we'll start to do basic body comp. And then as we continue to talk about those things, we can start to get into bigger ideas. Like maybe we'll talk about with Dr. Rimmer, muscle to bone ratio, or using body composition as a predictive tool for weight gain or things like that. And so that's kind of how I approached it. It wasn't a unilateral approach. No two coaches kind of got the same reports. And I had 3 different head coaches, and they all actually had a different level of caring about it. One was very kind of hands-on and wanted, everything. He wanted to know everything that was going on. And the other one was just like, hey, just come to me when there's an issue. I don't care about anything else. I trust what you guys are doing down there. Just flag things for me, because I'm really busy like doing our game, game strategy stuff. So I guess that's a long answer to say that it was just a very, I had a vision, but I was flexible in my approach with how I was going to get there. Instead of kind of going in and trying to plop the Olympic model in, let's say, to the NFL, which I learned very, very quickly they were not ready for. And they're kind of getting to it now. They're kind of getting to an Olympic model maybe 10 years after what Ernie and I and others that were working in the Olympic model were doing, 15, 20 years ago. So anyway, I hope that answers your question, but that's kind of my approach.
What were some, I know in the NFL, when you're talking about some of these old school coaches, and I've sat in some meetings where they'll come in and say, this player needs to be at this body weight or this body weight. And sometimes there's this no rational thought process that goes into that number. What were some strategies you did to educate the coach that maybe didn't want to be educated at first, but you with your strategies, they did become educated?
Yeah. So, I mean, it really just depended on the coach's personality. I always really tried to just develop a good relationship with that person as a human being to start off with, so that when we would have these debates, we could have them collegially and it wouldn't just be like an order. But I mean, I remember there was one player distinctly on our team who he had a year-to-year weight management problem, and his position coach just wanted him at this one weight. And just year to year, like, he just, because he was a yo-yo dieter, and so he just kept getting heavier and heavier and heavier. And it was this point of contention that we all had. And it was, the position coach wanting this and him telling us. And then at one point we were all arguing about it. And then I just kind of made the comment, like, has anyone talked to the guy? Because like last time I checked, the player is the one that needs to be at this weight. And here we are all having these arguments about it. And the other realization that we had to kind of communicate to coaches as well is like, I am not the athlete's not a robot where we can just program in what we want in his back and he's going to get to that weight. Like, he's not motivated. He doesn't think he needs to be there. And so it's there's no straight answer to that, but it was kind of just also calling out the situation, because sometimes that's what ends up happening, especially in football, is we like argue about this player, everybody not really behind their back, but without even really integrating the player into the conversation. And I don't know why that is. Maybe it's just this, it's a fear of communication. This was a very high profile player that nobody wanted to piss off. And he was kind of immature. So there was this tiptoeing around him as well that was occurring. That happens again very often in the NFL. But ultimately, that player needs to be the one buying into the decision as well. And he had a few rough years, and then guess what? As they all do, they get old and they realize, oh man, I got a shelf life here. And then, by his last few seasons with us, he was all about making his weight, coming back down to normal. So but I'm with you, but I think it's also respecting that coach. I mean, I worked with, I'll tell a story about Vic Fangio, and he'll let me say this. He's a good friend of mine, but the first time I ever met Vic Fangio when I started at the Bears, he was our defensive coordinator. I told him what I did, and the first thing he said to me was, "I don't believe in science. You can just walk away from me. I don't want to hear anything you have to say." And that's literally how we first met. And it was that's just how he was. And then as we just kind of continued our relationship and education, and I would bring him stuff, when he was working at the Broncos as a head coach, him and I were actually having calls about some of their data and some of their injury issues, and he was actually interested in that. So I feel like it's just a relationship first, and then, small bits of information, and always making it just applicable to a problem or something that's really just tangible, instead of pie in the sky things. Like, for example, at the Bears, we did all of our GPS data as percent game data. And because our coaches didn't understand what load was, they just didn't get it. And so we all made it as percent game. So I could go to the DB coach and say, today your volume was 10% of what you would do in a game. And so you aren't doing enough. Your speed was, I'm picking on DBs because they were always our slow guys. But they were the ones that we were saying, hey, you actually you're at 20% of game speed today for your group. That's actually a problem. So, and so we made it all referencing to the game, and that made it really, really applicable to them. And so all the sports science people might say, don't do that. That's the wrong way to present the data. But it was the way that it worked for our coaches. Do you guys have any experiences with that kind of stuff too? I'm sure you do. I mean, I find the best way is just to try to figure out what makes them tick and then making it really applicable to them at their level.
I would say I've had a little bit, but it wasn't necessarily on the strength and conditioning side. I had another role, and that was on the sports psych side, so the mental conditioning. I served as the deliverer of mental performance while I was the strength and conditioning coach, and just having a few coaches saying, "I don't believe in that mumbo jumbo," or "that sounds like a bunch of psychobabble to me." Like, that was a quote. Like, wow, I just went to school and like worked really hard to help this team, and I just want to share the information. And so some of them, they never got it, but it didn't matter because the head coach was all about it. And
Sure.
as long as you have the right people that are on board, then you feel like what you do is valued, and then there's worth, and you don't worry about those that won't get it. And he didn't end up coaching much longer anyway, so I didn't have to deal with him. And then I'm sure there were other challenges that I had to overcome, but that's just part of it. Working with people that are really good at what they do, and they question what you do. It's like, no, I'm really good at what I do, but I can help you. And so sometimes that's a challenge. But I really like your approach of assessing and then just sitting down and developing that relationship. I think that goes a long way. So I'll let Dr. Reimer continue with that question.
I've definitely experienced it. I mean, one of the things that you said is this idea that no two coaches got the same report. And I hope that the sports science audience is listening today and paying really close to what experienced professionals like yourself are saying in podcasts like this or at conferences, because the theme is the same. Like, what I have observed with, say, young sports scientists coming up is that they get really good at producing that one dashboard that everyone gets to look at. And the reality is, some people like a table of data. Some people like different types of graphics and charts. And some people just don't know how to look at data at all. Mm-hmm. And one of the big things you said is that no two coaches get the same report. And I just love that. Sometimes I think if you develop that relationship with someone that's strong enough, like you said, it does come down to relationships. I don't even think you need to give them a report, because they're going to pick up the phone when you call and hey, coach, I'm seeing something. Do you have a moment to talk? And they're like, yeah, they trust you. They see that you're calling, they pick up, you have a conversation, and it's settled. When they trust you, when someone trusts you, you don't need to give them a report. You just need to get their attention and have a conversation.
Yeah.
And so I just, to sum all that up, I think that we as an industry, by industry, I mean the emerging sports science industry in the United States, has to embrace what you just said. This idea that you work with the coaches, you work with your other support staff, you find out what information they need on a regular basis to do their jobs better, and you facilitate a path so that you can empower them to get that information and then go and do their job better. Because I promise you, the head coach, the offensive coordinator, the defensive coordinator, the running backs coach, the dietitian, the athletic trainer, the strength and conditioning coach, they all need different information to do their jobs better. Ted?
Oh, no, I
Bringing through your
agree.
brain right now.
Yeah, there's a saying that you would tell coaches relative to their athletes, you can only teach what they're capable of learning. And with regard to sports science, that statement applies to the coaches that you deal with. So, I try to find out what their comfort level is and present them information according to that. And, Jen just did a great job of explaining that. But that's the key to having a successful sports science program, is understanding those basic tenets of a program like that.
Well, and I think also it's I used to always tell my intern, like, realize where we are in the solar system. We're orbiting around a sun. We are not we are not the center of the solar system. So my job is to orbit around the head coach and the team as a support staff. That's why we're called support staff or service providers. My job is to serve. My job is to support. I'm not the center of the sun. So there might be some great ideas that I think we should do. Like, I remember early days coming out of Colorado, I had this infatuation with, obviously, altitude training, right? This is what we have here at the Olympic Training Center. We're always high and low and low and high. And there's so much fun stuff with that. And I remember, we had this company come in and I was trying to sell, like, our head trainer on doing some hypoxic training during rehab as a way to add more stress, so they wouldn't have, because they're in that rehab phase where they maybe can't get enough intensity. And I'm like, let's go hypoxic, let's do this. And I'm like writing up protocols and just geeking out on it because I love this stuff, right? And and they just weren't interested in it. Like, the trainers, they just were like, no, it's too complicated. This machine, we got to get it calibrated. Like, no interest in it, and that's okay, but that's an example of me thinking, like, why aren't we doing this? We all need to be doing hypoxic training, like, hello, but in the reality of that sport medicine world, it just wasn't applicable. And so I had to respect that and realize, that I thought I had a great idea, but I'm not the sun. I'm just orbiting around trying to help.
So how do you balance all of your research, all of your reading, your education, your experiences, and you are ready to bring all of that to that situation? And then you realize someone says, no, you can keep about 95% of that. I only want 5%.
Yeah.
How do you, for the young up and coming, or maybe even the experienced professionals that need a different approach, what advice do you give them? Like, what internally are some things you should consider to help you navigate that situation better?
For me, and that was my situation in the NFL, because, like I said, I came in with like this really advanced approach from the Olympic world, and then I walked into like 20 years ago, like really, really backwards. No sports science, no sport nutrition, no physiology. What does physiology even mean? What is ACSM? Literally. So for me, what I did was, and this was just my personal approach, was I just looked at, am I moving the needle every year? And so I looked at, okay, season 1, what is it that I can do? What are they going to give me budget for? Okay, now the next season, when they come back to me, because, there's always that budget question. What do you need? What do you want to do? Okay, I want to move the needle a little bit further along. And so I had goals. For example, I really wanted us to get a DEXA. That was part of my hope. We were using bod pod, and that could be really unreliable, especially with our population. And so it was kind of an incremental approach every year to trying to get that DEXA, which we did. I also was trying, I'm like, we're doing nothing biomechanically here, like zero biomechanical assessment. We're doing an FMS, and depending on who our head strength coach is, that's not happening. And that was a project that every year I tried to just poke the bear about, didn't literally, and then it didn't happen. And then finally, in my 7th season, the league had a partnership with Dari, and all of a sudden all these teams got free Daris. And so it's kind of like having your vision. What's my dream for this program? Realizing that Rome wasn't built in a day, and then feeling any little win you can get year to year that you're progressing your program. That's how I used to do it. How I used to feel, encouraged that I was making change. And if you get to a situation where you really have no change from year to year, then you probably just have to have an honest conversation with whoever you report to and say, what are we doing here? Like, the rest of the world is progressing and we are stagnant. And is this what we're all about? And you just have to be able to say, if that's what they're all about, because they're winning, and let's just repeat, rinse and repeat. You just have to realize that's the culture you're in, and you have to make the decision as to whether or not that's the right spot for you to be. That's just my humble opinion. Anyone else want to comment on that?
I'm really jumping up and down to try to answer that question. I think, Pat, at the beginning you said experiences, all of your experiences, your research, your education, your readings, you're ready to come in, you're chomping at the bit, and they were like, yeah, no, not interested. To me, the answer is pretty simple. We're problem solvers. That's it. So now you can't always control the experiences you get instead of like job experience, because you sometimes you got to go through a process and to be able to get different jobs. So let's set the actual job itself. But once you're in the job, we're solving problems. And I'll state this very simply. I'm a do-it-yourself project guy around the house. And one time I had this leaky ledge on my roof, and I looked into it to fix it. I went to the store and I bought a roofing hammer, very specific tool that I needed to fix it. I fixed the problem. I put the roofing hammer in my toolbox. It's still there. The next time I encounter a problem on my roof, I now have a roofing hammer to pull that out and retool it. One time I needed a leather punch for an application. So I bought a leather punch, and I haven't used it since, but it's in the toolbox. So that's my experience, my research, my education, my readings. I built my own deck, and to build the deck, I had to buy some roofer's knee pads. And now those are in the toolbox, but now I am the head coach of a 5- and 6-year-old little league team, and it's coach pitch, and the coaches all pitch from one knee. And I've retooled one of the knee pads for that one knee so that it's in the dirt. So sometimes an old tool that solved the one problem can be now adapted to solve a new problem. So all your experience, your research, your educations and readings, really, it should just make you chomp at the bit to apply that to a new problem.
That's brilliant.
Good stuff.
After all, sports science, the first step of the scientific method is to identify a problem. Our job is to solve problems.
Yep.
So can we get Jen to get nerdy for us? Like, break down some research, like pull out, let's go there. Let's talk about what's out there. Oh, go for it. Yes.
Yep. So like I used to work on a ranch, and in high school, I worked on a ranch, and we would brand cattle. We would mark them. We would do all kinds of things. We would brand cattle. And then when they would get big, they would sell them, and they would get sold based on their weight. So how big they got was really, really important. And it was really good to have big cows. So, what could you tell me about like the cattle industry and other meat industries that might apply to humans?
Thanks. That was a good lead up. So, I have something called it's called ISAC. It's International Association for the Advancement of Cananthropometry, and cananthropometry is just the measurement of the human body. And they have kind of 3 levels of accreditation you can get with them: level 1, 2, and 3. And basically, they teach you different ways to measure the human body. A level 1 assessment, you're taught a standardized way to assess 7 skin fold or 8 skin fold sites plus some bone breadths. And then the level 2 assessment, when you become a level 2 ISAC certified anthropometrist, you learn 32 measurements of the human body, which includes things like, scapular breadth and bilateral crystal breadth and all kinds of fun bone measurements and circumferences and ways to measure the body. And so the application of the level 2 assessment globally is usually used in talent identification programs. So we know that wingspan is really important for swimming, right? And so we can do a bunch of studies where we analyze elite swimming populations and then say, hey, if I'm coming up through a talent identification pathway and my kid has a wingspan that's like this, he's going to be best suited for rowing or swimming or things like that. And so for countries that don't have an NCAA system and a massive amount of population, they use like iterations of like the level 2 assessment to do talent identification. Australia has a brilliant model that they actually implement within their high school systems, where they basically do some basic physiological testing to measure things like, maximum oxygen intake and things like that. And they do some anthropometry. And then the kiddo in high school will get like a report of like the top 4 sports or top 5 sports that they're best suited for, physiologically speaking. So there's a lot of people globally, like Cuba has like a crazy talent ID program. And it's pretty amazing because the Cubans are very, very good at whatever they decide to invest funding into in terms of their sports, because they have this kind of really integrated talent ID program within the country. So this is kind of what like a lot of people nerd out with in the Olympic world. And working in combat sports, they aren't necessarily well-funded NCAA sports. So we're not necessarily dominating at everything around the world. So we're always kind of looking to ways to get better in the US. But anyway, all this being said is there's some research coming out by a fellow named Dr. Francis Holloway out of Argentina. And it's actually been going on for a long, long time. In the 70s and 80s, they started to measure something called muscle to bone ratio, which is basically when you do a level 2 assessment, you can get measures about bone, the weight of bone on an individual, the amount of bone mass somebody has, and in addition to that, the amount of muscle that they have. And what they were doing was looking at the cattle industry, and what they were finding is in when you're raising cattle and trying to determine how much meat you can grow on the cow, you look at the frame of the cow. So almost similar to like a chassis on a car. I'm going to measure my chassis, and then I can determine how much weight I can hold on my chassis. And that's what they do in the cattle industry. The skeletal structure of the cow, how much meat can we grow on this? And so that was kind of the early days of muscle to bone ratio and what it was being applied for. And then in these early kind of anthropometric population studies where they do them at the Olympics and things like that, they started looking at this muscle to bone ratio in athletes. And it kind of died away. And now it's kind of been resurrected a little bit with this fellow, Dr. Francis Holloway, especially in football. He's now been 2 years at the combine doing level 2 assessments on athletes and also calculating the muscle to bone ratio. And so we don't know a ton yet, but what's being theorized is, how can we use this? Okay, well, we can use this to potentially say, let me measure your chassis and let's see how much muscle we can actually add onto this frame. And that can be from a situation where you're dealing with a really lanky outside linebacker that coaches want to gain, 40 pounds coming out of college or coming into the NFL. And you can kind of do some estimations to determine whether or not that's actually plausible from a actual physiological perspective. It's not just let's put my hand around their wrist and see if they're small boned or big bone, those types of things. It's kind of putting a little bit more research around it. And then the other application that he's looking to do is, can we then start to have best versus rest comparisons where we take a look at, what's the average muscle bone ratio for a running back, for example, and then trying to look at, can we characterize positions a little bit? And then kind of the third big idea that's swirling around this is there a theoretical upper limit that you could push your body to for your muscle to bone ratio, whereby if you start to overload your frame, you're more susceptible to injury, right? Which kind of makes sense, right? And we've kind of seen it before, especially just anecdotally in linemen, because they're all, well, not all, probably 80% of linemen are bigger than they're supposed to be based on what they are, physiologically and anatomically. And that's evidenced by the fact that if you look at them when they retire, you can't even recognize them because they're like 280 pounds, right? And you're like, whoa, who are you? You're 250, 280 pounds, because their body's not used to holding that much. So it's just this whole really fascinating world in the anthropometry sphere that's gaining some traction with Dr. Holloway, that's going around and measuring teams and talking about it. And like I said, we're kind of early days, especially in the football world. Everybody in football is raving about this metric and thinking that it's maybe more robust than what we know about it. But essentially, it's using a level 2 assessment to measure bone, measure muscle, then basically doing like a quick little division calculation, muscle over bone, and then coming up with this ratio and trying to understand what that means. Sorry, we geeked out there for a little bit.
Well,
So
go ahead,
back
Ted.
in the 1970s, there was, 60s and 70s, there was a ton of research, with the talent identification and the different athletes with somatotyping. So literally, it's like somatotyping on steroids, so to speak, adding another layer to the, somatotype research that's already existing.
Yeah, and so that was like, Kearney. There was kind of an early group. There's the fellow that kind of started ISAC was a Canadian guy actually by the name of Bill Ross. And so him and a bunch of his colleagues in that time frame, exactly what you're talking about, started doing all these measurements, mainly at Olympic Games. They would do these huge population measurements, looking at somatotype, looking at MBR, and kind of just like geeking out on that. And then they kind of, I don't know if maybe BodPod killed it. I don't know who killed it. Maybe BodPod killed it. But somehow it just kind of went out of favor. And then there are people globally looking at it. The problem with the measurement is you have to have your level 2 certification, because if you aren't standardizing your technique for taking the measures, then your data is garbage, right? So there's a few people around the world looking at this, and it's been exciting to kind of watch Francis start to explore this notion within the NFL. Ernie, do you have any cows you want to measure? I was talking about getting a cow the other day here. We could maybe grow one together if you'd like.
Yeah, we should. Well, let's make sure we can see its parents. Make sure its parents have large skeletons. And then
we'll do some predictive equations.
Maybe we can predict the calf's muscle to bone ratio from its parents' skeletons and do some genetics. Just kidding. But the reason why I'm really interested in this, I think this has been a question that has been posed to me from college football coaches hey, is there a way, when we bring in recruits and they're 17 years old and they're coming in, and can we like measure their skeleton and determine how heavy they can get? And so this is just been something that's been asked of me, and I never really had an answer. I am level 1 ISAC certified, but I never got to the level 2. The way we started to look at the issue was that we started to run regression functions using NFL Combine data, where we would put the players in position groups, and we would, within their position groups, we ran a function of height and body weight from NFL combine data. So for any player we had, if you're this height and you're this weight, we know that, at least according to the NFL combine, all other players with that height in your position are in this weight range. So we actually at least know that this is where you probably want to get to, but we didn't get to the point to say, are you even capable of getting to that based on your skeletal structure? So I'd be curious to know from Ted, who is an NFL consultant. You get to talk to a lot of different people at NFL teams. And have you encountered this type of issue, or coaches or support staff asking questions around this?
Yeah, to Jen's point, I would say over the last 3 years, it's in fact at this past year's combine, Francis Holloway presented to the NFL dietitians group, and so I'm fine. You're seeing more staffs that are getting the ISAC certification. Now, sometimes when they'll go through and do their measurements, and so I was talking to one of the teams, and they had a high-profile wide receiver, and they said, based off our assessments, he should only really weigh 168 pounds. I said, that might be true. I said, but he's going to get killed at 168 pounds.
Yeah.
So sometimes, you'll have situations like that where you have to weigh and consider, the information that you get. Other cases, it can be, dead on in terms of, hey, listen, you think we're going to bring this guy in and he's going to weigh, 315. Our assessments say that he's got to hold about 295. That extra 20 is probably not going to come, easily based off this individual's frame size. So yes, definitely seeing a lot more of that.
Yeah, something Oh, go ahead, Jen.
No, I was going to say it's definitely early days when it comes to that body of work. And so, and I think that there's, it's scary in the beginning, especially when we don't know a lot, because then people start to make inferences. And I think that's the part that really, it happens all the time, especially in the NFL, because I feel like everyone just wants to latch on to the bottom line and they don't want to wait. And so they just start to make inferences that can be dangerous sometimes. And then you just, like you said, you're losing touch with the reality of the game. So.
But it's definitely a great information source to have when you're making decisions that didn't exist for most teams, say 5 years ago. So I think it's definitely helps the decision-making process.
Yeah. Jen, I have experience using a DEXA, and we used it pretty extensively with our football team. And our dietitian would notice some strange, I guess, occurrences because, we went from skin fold to DEXA, and she noticed that maybe, and we didn't publish the research, so this is all anecdotal, but she thought that maybe there was an increase in bone mineral density in season as the season went along, and or bone mineral content, maybe. I don't know, maybe both. And we just theorized maybe it's because of the contact that's happening, and maybe there's something happening there. I wish that we would look more into what the DEXA could tell us in terms of bone mineral density and bone mineral content on athletes, and even maybe looking at concussions and what happens in terms of your bone mineral density or bone mineral content. Did you look at anything that you never published, but maybe you saw it and thought that, I wonder if this is something?
When using DEXA?
Yes.
Yeah. So what you're saying is really interesting. I challenged last time Ernie and I chatted, I challenged him to come up with, because he's the equations guy. I'm like, we got to come up with some sort of equation where we can infer, MBR from DEXA, which I think could be really easy if we just use Ernie to do that. So Ernie, that's your task. For me, what I was using for DEXA, which which I thought to be pretty interesting. And again, it was just this, we started to find this interesting correlation. So when I was DEXA, I've done a lot of DEXA work over the years, but when I was DEXAing wrestling athletes, one of the things that I thought was really, really interesting was, so when you do the DEXA, you kind of have to line everything up before you kind of look at, you put the anatomy into basically two sides, and you kind of, you have to line everything up with the system, and then you get your reading. And what I always used to marvel at with wrestlers was that they were really, really symmetrical. And, you know, and there was this weird thing in the wrestling world where, like, I had a guy with perfect symmetry, literally on our DEXA, like exact musculature right to left. And it started to kind of just be a trend that, like, the more symmetrical they were, like, they were better. Like, all my gold medalists were very, very symmetrical. And I thought it was really fascinating. And of course, for wrestling, you have to use your entire body, right? Like, you have to be able to use your whole body. We used to joke around and say, you even use your toes in wrestling. Like, you use everything. So that was just something that always, like, popped into my head. And then when I would do our DEXAs with our NFL players, one year I just was like, I'm just going to do a symmetry study and just see, like, is there a relationship between symmetry and, like, anything, you know? And it was really informal. But what was really interesting was, like, our best players were actually the most symmetrical. And I remember presenting the data to my GM and just being like, all of our starters have better symmetry than our guys down the food chain, so to speak. And so that was just really something I found interesting that we never went any deeper in. And I was really interested in kind of looking at that symmetry, and whether or not you could maybe look at upper body symmetry versus lower body symmetry, depending on what their position was and whether that mattered. You know, and obviously your symmetry can be impacted by, you know, injury history and things like that. But it was just a finding that we had that we were able to get really easily from DEXA data, because you have to kind of compartmentalize the body. And when you look at the reports, they give you a left versus right comparison. So that was something that I thought was pretty interesting, that I haven't done any more information on, but we absolutely saw a relationship between the kind of best players on the team having the best symmetry anatomically when we looked at DEXA data, when it came to musculature.
Amazing. Thank you.
We're geeking out on this stuff. I have a crazy question for the group.
Go ahead. You first.
This is not related to DEXA, though. This
Neither
is a question. Okay. This was a question that I had for you, Ernie, when we first met, because this is the one I want to geek out on with all you guys. And it's something that it bothers me all the time. Okay, so in football, we always talk about getting into football shape. And when I'm a cyclist or I'm a runner, I can measure that, right? It's a time sport, and I kind of know when I'm in racing season, like when I'm in race shape, right? Because my times tell me that, and I know what my PR is. And I can do some physiology testing that's going to tell me where my physiology is at to know when I'm in my peak shape, right? And so it's interesting to me because in football, we always talk about getting into football shape. But no one has ever really been able to really define what that is. And I always used to find it really challenging, because we're trying to get into football shape, but we don't actually know what that means. Because is football shape, you can say that training camp gets us into football shape, but to your point, Dr. Ivey, there's no impact there, right? So we're just playing against each other, and we're having some preseason stuff, and we're just kind of touching each other, and we're not really getting hit. And whether or not you want to believe it, that's part of the sport. So there's got to be some sort of adaptation that goes along with being hit, right? But then if you look at midway through the season, is that football shape? Well, from a strength perspective, maybe your strength's starting to decline because your lifting is going down because of the impact of the season. You might change your lifting program to more maintenance. So anyway, that's my question for everybody. I feel like if we could just nerd out and decide on just some sort of battery of tests or some sort of definition, and maybe bring in some coaches or some players, because that was one of the projects I always had a nerd out wanting to do, is just trying to understand, how can we define what that is? Because in football, until we can really define that, how do we know when we get there?
this might be podcast number 2 that we're starting into.
Okay.
So this
Is
will
this-
be the
this-
will be the last question because we're going to wrap it up. But
Oh,
really,
right. Okay, sorry. Time's going
really,
crazy.
this should be another podcast.
Okay.
I'll start football shape. I think the resistance. So we used to do also what we call resisted conditioning, because some of our athletes needed to be able to push or pull something to get into shape. So you couldn't just run, you just couldn't lift. You needed different distances. You needed to be able to start, stop, accelerate, decelerate, change direction, jump. There's so many aspects to the sport of football. I think we don't do it right because we don't think of it as a continuum. We don't think of summer training into preseason, into season in a smooth continuum. There's these rapid ramp ups that happen and the athletes aren't ready for it. And the truth is, I could never, as a strength and conditioning coach, actually train them long enough to be able to be ready for a football practice that was going to be twice as long as what I was allowed to train them. So I will stop there.
It is another podcast.
Yeah, I think sometimes, to your point, that when these guys are in their best football shape, which could be, say, week 4 or 5, that some of their other aspects may be declining. You see that in basketball. They're
Sure.
in their best. They're clicking as a team. They're in their best basketball shape, but their vertical jumps are below their PRs, and some other aspects may not be. But basketball wise, they're probably at their peak. So I think that's hard sometimes to realize that some variables that you think, that correlate with, for instance, vertical jump and basketball performance should be at their best when they're in their best basketball shape. That's not the case. And you've seen it in football that, but boy, now they're used to going, 60, 63 plays in this game. They're going hurry up offense a lot more frequently. So they're probably in their best football shape, but what that is, and I don't know if you measure it, it's more observational.
Mm-hmm.
Ernie?
I have a habit of always bringing my agendas to these podcasts, and you fed right into one of them. It's really simple. I feel like exercise physiology is heavily underlooked or overlooked. I would say it's heavily overlooked in American mainstream sport. If we want to understand football shape, we need to start doing more football exercise physiology to understand what that actually looks like from a physiological standpoint.
Yeah, amen to that.
Now, Jen, our last question to all of our guests is, if there's 3 books you could recommend to our listeners, what would they be?
Oh my gosh. Okay, I wasn't ready for this one.
It doesn't have to be on a nutrition topic. It could be on any topic.
Okay, well, I have to give a nutrition book because that's just kind of, and I'm not biased because I have a chapter in it, but I do. But I think that anybody who's in the field of nutrition or working in the field of nutrition needs to have, it's called Clinical Sport Nutrition. It's by Louise Burke and Vicki Deacon. And it is literally the Bible of sport nutrition. And you can look at all the other, textbooks out there, but this is kind of written by the best. The chapters are written by the best. And definitely it's definitely one that I have as a resource all the time. Different iterations of it. But definitely that is my kind of clinical book. In terms of like reading books, I'm trying to think. You've put me on the spot because I'm trying to think of what my favorites have been. Oh, I'm going to be really girly about the second one. It's Eat, Pray, Love. Can we omit that one? I don't know.
We have a diverse audience. So
Yes.
Man, I think see, I'm the type of person, because I'm such an intellectual, like data research person, that when I read or when I like to be entertained, I go like complete crazy, you know, like I just really like escaping things that make me think too hard. So yeah. And then, yeah, I mean, old school, like anything by Paulo Coelho, I really like, I guess. Again, I'm sorry, these aren't really geeky books, but yeah, I'm kind of embarrassed, but those are the ones that's kind of what's on my shelf.
That is awesome. I mean, it just goes to show your well-roundedness, and which helps you to relate to so many different people. And I think that comes through, and it comes through really clearly. So we want to say thank you for joining us.
Thanks, guys.
And I think, the offer is out there. If we can get you for podcast number 2, and maybe talk about your chapter in the book and other things that you've accomplished and things that you want to accomplish, and maybe even some challenges and harder questions for Dr. Ernie Reimer, we would love to have you back. So
yeah, it would be awesome, guys. This was a lot of fun. I mean, our hour just evaporated, so that was great.
Yep. Well, we appreciate you. Thank you so much for joining us. And
thanks,
everyone,
guys.
Yep. Have a great evening.
Thanks, Jen.
Thanks, guys. Good to see you.
Bye, everyone.
Good to see you again, Ted.
Nice seeing you. Bye-bye.